It was about 5 years ago, I think it was in February 2009, my youngest son Larry urged me to write down, to record some of the more memorable family stories, yarns that I'd told over the years. I started doing this and did manage to get some of the tales written down. And I was actually planning to work with Myra to edit what I'd written. However, at that time, Myra was very busy with her company TriMed, and I somehow just lost interest. So nothing more was done for years, and the Word file remained unopened until March of this year, that's 2014. The event that triggered a renewed interest in getting the job done was the death of an old friend and business colleague, Willie Hugelshofer. I had hired Willie in 1973 in Johannesburg, South Africa, to work on the development of a mini computer system called Cypher, SYFA, which actually stood for System for Access, or as people kidded, System from Africa. And Willie at that time was maybe in his early 20s, mid-20s. In 1975, Willie traveled with me, Zach Kong, and the rest of the Cypher team from Johannesburg to Irvine, California. And thereafter, Willie had worked with the Socher family for over 30 years, from 1973 until I think it was around 2003 when he finally retired. Well, anyway, in March 2013, Willie was diagnosed with kidney cancer, but did not tell anybody outside his family. Apparently, Willie and his wife Susanna were determined to avoid the having to deal with or see the anguish and sympathy and sadness of his old friends and buddies. He chose instead to live the rest of his life supported by his wife and two daughters. So he went through surgery and chemo and radiation as they battled the cancer. So not knowing that Willie was ill, let alone suffering from a terminal disease, I was aghast. I was absolutely shocked when Susanna posted on her Facebook page that Willie had died. I can't tell you, it just shocked me. And what Willie and Susanna had agreed that there would be no funeral. Instead, Willie's body was cremated, and in the spring, a celebration of life was held, and his ashes were scattered on one of the lakes where he had loved sailing. This approach to dying had a very deep impact on me. I gotta say, I love the approach Willie and Susanna took to spare their friends, much hand-wringing and worry and the extended sadness of the disease that he was going through. Willie's death and his handling really triggered a lot of thinking and self-analysis, and soul-searching on my part, and I really finally faced up to hard facts. I now realize that unless I get the task of recording some of the family history and talking about some of the people in the family in the very near future, it's likely never, almost certain never to be completed. So I'm giving it a try now. The reason for reaching this conclusion are that I've come to understand that both my physical and my mental health are declining at an accelerating pace. There's no ducking it. In February 2011, I underwent a kidney transplant. And since then, I've had to take anti-rejection drugs. The side effects of these drugs leave my mind very, very foggy, and my body shaky. It's become clear that my body and brain are very sensitive to any type of drug and react poorly to drugs, even in the smallest of doses. I'm now taking anti-rejection drugs, the absolute minimum that might prevent rejection, but I'm still foggy. By the way, the reason that I had to have a transplant was that in South Africa, before we came here, I suffered from headaches, and I'd become addicted to an over-the-counter analgesic painkiller, Saridone, which seriously damaged my kidneys. Obviously, at that time, I didn't know the damage was being caused. So my propensity towards addictive behavior directly caused the serious medical problems that I've experienced later in life. Now, hopefully my family can learn a lesson from this and manage to avoid or overcome any addictive behaviors or tendencies that they may have. It's not quite as simple as that, but I hope that is the case for them. I've also come to understand and accept the reality that my brain functions are deteriorating, and I may well be, and probably am, experiencing early dementia. Considering that both my parents suffered from dementia, and in the case of my mother, the dementia turned into full-blown Alzheimer's disease, albeit at older age than I'm at the moment. My mental decline for genetic reasons is certainly understandable and certainly to be expected. So if I look at it, the combination of drug side effects and declining brain functions of the dementia has meant that since the transplant, I haven't read a single book. This is quite alarming to me and surprising, as I have always been my whole life an avid reader. Nowadays I find it very difficult to concentrate when reading, even when reading the newspaper, and often have to reread sentences several times before the meaning sinks in, if it does sink in at all. I find myself reading fewer and fewer articles each day, and for a person who used to read the newspaper from front page to last, this is a sign of my decline. My hearing's also deteriorated rapidly. As a youth, I hunted in the South African bushveld and doing military training exercises that involved tanks firing and artillery barrages. The exposure to the explosive sounds damaged my ears. In those days, ear protection wasn't used, so I now have to wear hearing aids which are, at best, only marginally effective. Just ask Myra about how loud I still have to have the TV in order to hear. Now, my poor hearing, coupled with declining mental capabilities, mean that I have difficulty following conversations, both in real life and even on TV. I find myself sitting with people and then politely nodding while I'm actually having difficulty hearing and or grasping what is being said. So while I'm not following what's going on, I've learned to nod as if I'm part of it. Also, I'm pretty sure that I now suffer from something known as post-polio syndrome, which is causing weakness in my leg and back muscles. Those were the muscles that were attacked when I had polio as a child. So now I struggle to get out of chairs, and I'm finding it more and more difficult to walk. The arthritis in my ankle has become so bad that every step I take is very, very painful. In 1974, my ankle was broken in a single car accident in which I skidded off a country road into a ditch, and I totaled the fancy Alfa Romeo sports car which I'd bought for Maya. This was her car which I'd borrowed. I think she had my car to schlep the kids somewhere. Well, anyway, with my luck, and I got to tell you, luck has played huge roles in my life, all aspects of my life. I was actually saved by two registered nurses who part-time made some extra bucks as striptease artists, and they were on their way to the club where they moonlighted as strippers. They saw the accident, pulled me out of the car, which was in the ditch. I was unconscious. Had they not been driving behind me, I almost certainly would have died of exposure and the injuries, broken ribs, jaw, ankle, but I was saved. A metal pin was inserted to hold the ankle together. Now all the cartilage is finally worn away, and there's bone rubbing against bone. That's pretty painful. So now you've had to listen to oh, by the way, the fact that I'd been drinking and driving led to that accident and led to me paying a very steep price for foolish actions. Had I not been drinking and driving, I'd be able to walk. So anyway, this old man is in steep and rapid decline, and that's the way it is. But anyway, enough whining, no point in it. But here I am. I'm inspired by Willie's illness and his death, and plus the realization that my body and mind are degenerating. I'm going to try and finish the task Larry asked me to do. Unfortunately, I am having difficulty in putting the stories into any coherent or logically flowing sequence. I'm having difficulty doing it, and on top of that, I'm not much of a writer, so the stuff I'd written down just doesn't read too well. So instead of writing the stories, I'm going to try videotaping and really hope that it works. If it does work, I'll be able to produce a video history so that my family can get some feel for the absolutely amazing lives and courage and character of Maya and my parents, and the very interesting lives that Myra and I have led. Time will tell whether I can actually get this done. Let me talk a little bit about religion. Bad subject, but I should talk about it. My father and all the members of the Socher family were members of Orthodox synagogues, and they all kept strictly kosher homes. Now, this all changed after Jenny's funeral, when the rabbi and the Chevra Kadisha reneged on the promise to Dad not to schnoder at Jenny's funeral. From that day, Dad turned his back on Judaism and on the synagogue in particular. However, my mother really wanted me to be bar mitzvah. The idea of not being bar mitzvah was socially unacceptable, and she persuaded Dad to relent. After much nagging, the family joined a Reform congregation. We attended Temple Israel regularly until my bar mitzvah, and even afterwards would go there occasionally on high holy days. In my youth, I did believe in a God. I got sold the idea. Dad used to leave home in the early hours of Monday mornings to travel around the bushveld, buying cattle from farmers. And he usually came home very, very late on Friday nights. While he was away, I was dead scared that he'd be in an accident and just might not come home. So every day and every night that he was away, I prayed to God, asking him to keep my beloved Dad safe. And I was very earnest in the way I prayed. I really did fear losing my father. However, by the time I went to university, I had come to seriously doubt the existence of God. The ideas that were promoted by religions simply made no sense at all. The stories and the fables were just that, neat stories, but based in reality, they certainly weren't. However, knowing that Hitler, the Nazis, had slaughtered anybody who had any Jewish blood in them, irrespective of whether they believed in or practiced Judaism, I clearly recognized that I could never escape the fact of my Jewish blood. You mustn't forget, this was in I was born in mid-40s, and in the 50s, it wasn't that long after the Holocaust. Now, when the Jewish community in South Africa responded to Israel's appeals for financial help when Israel launched the Six-Day War, Myra and I donated much more than we could afford. We feared that the destruction of Israel would be bad for Jews all around the world. The existence of Israel did provide a protection for Jews, or so we thought. Then, shortly after the Yom Kippur War, a decade or so later, the Yom Kippur War, I traveled to Israel to see if I could help a friend who had set up a similar computer business to mine in South Africa. He'd set that up in Israel. When I got there, he and his staff were really at the front, still guarding. So what I did was send staff from our South African company to help his company survive, while he and his employees were on military duty, on active duty. And we managed to pull it through to take care of his company. After deciding we had to leave South Africa and committing to my dad that we would, I did briefly consider moving to Israel. I decided that life in Israel would just be too tough, and making a living would be very difficult for me because Israelis are very, very competitive, very smart, and in most cases absolutely ruthless. And I also did not want Raoul and Larry to be exposed to military service. Now, while I no longer believed in the Jewish religion and the rites and the rituals, etc., I did recognize that our Jewish heritage and that of the Jewish heritage of my children might one day result in their persecution. History has a sad way of repeating itself. And in today, looking around at the ISIS army and radical Muslim jihadism, this may well be the case. So Maya and I decided that we would make our Raoul and Larry clearly aware of their Jewish background. So we used to benchlich light candles on a Friday night and say Kiddush every Friday night. Raoul and Larry were aware of their Jewish blood. And we did this for many years until they left for college. Now, over the years, kind of influenced by reading the works of well-known atheists like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and others, I moved from agnosticism, where I didn't know, to atheism, and I'm now very comfortable realizing that when I die, when people die, that's that. It's all over. There's no life after death. There's no resurrection, no Messiah, Mashiach. There are no 72 virgins waiting for me or for anybody else. We have a blessed life while we're on earth, and that's that. Now, the reasons I want my body to be cremated when I die are because I really want people to forget me as quickly as possible. And the very last thing I want people to get on with their lives and without thinking about me. The notion of being sad while visiting graves on anniversaries is something that I just don't want for me. Also, cremation is better for the environment, so cremate my body, dump the ashes down the nearest drain, and get on with life, move on. Better still, I'm looking into donating my body to science, to medical schools or for research. That way, save some money. They eventually, I think, cremate the remains, and so that would be cheaper than cremation. By the way, it's really, then perhaps a year or two after I die, my family can hold a kind of celebration of life, somehow like Willie Hugelshofer, and laugh about the great life I led. And by the way, it's interesting to note that while Jews have achieved amazing success in many fields, in the arts, the sciences, in business, in many professions, the Jewish religion and the Jewish people has not recently produced any great humanitarian leaders, which I might have expected. There's no Mother Teresa, there hasn't been a Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi coming out of the Jewish population. So it seems to me that Jewish traditions seem to be somewhat focused inwards. Of course, one should never forget that the greatest humanitarian of all, Jesus Christ, was a Jew. Oh, now let me talk about a huge character in my life, my dad, Abraham Socher. Dad almost never ever talked about his past, and this meant that it was very difficult to find out very much about his life story. However, from talking with his sisters, some of my cousins, and his best friend, a guy by the name of Victor Fuster, about whom I'll say something a little bit later, I have managed to piece together a very rough biography of an absolutely amazing man who lived a remarkable life and to whom I owe so much. Now, according to Dad's passport, he was born on September the 5th, 1889. Now, that's a couple of centuries ago, in Lithuania, which at that time was part of Russia. However, there is good reason to believe that he may have been born a year or two earlier than that, though he's certainly not later than that. See, in those days, in Lithuania, births were not recorded, so he had no way of knowing exactly when or exactly where he had been born. According to three of his sisters, my Aunt Sarah, Hannah and Lizzie, whom I did get to know quite well as in my youth, the Socher family lived in a tiny shtetl, a village, called Schrednik, which I think is now known as Seredzius in Lithuania. There were no schools, and almost all the shtetl kids worked either in the home, the women or the females, or in the fields as families struggled to survive. Dad's father, my grandfather, was a schmoes, which is the word for a peddler, who pulled a hand wagon around selling schmatters and tzatzkas, odds and ends. By the way, this probably explains how we have the name Socher, which in Hebrew, Socher means merchant. That would explain how we get the name Socher, but I can't be 100% sure of it. Now, Dad was a very bright child. In fact, so bright that the Rebbe, the Rebbe in the shtetl, the rabbi, chose him to receive religious training. This was a huge honor and a very big deal for the Socher family, which dreamt that their Abram would become a rabbi, and that would be the ultimate achievement for a Jewish family. And at that time, Tsar Nicholas II ruled, and Jews were frequent victims of pogroms. The Cossacks enjoyed terrorizing the Jews. It was sport for them. Auntie Sarah told me how when one of their uncles tried to save his house from being razed to the ground, burnt to the ground, and he came out to try and stop it, he was killed by mounted Cossacks who used lances, they were on horseback, to torment and torture him for hours until he died. His family and all the villagers were forced to watch this barbarous torture and the killing of their uncle. Well, in the late 1890s, Russia went to war with Japan, and what they did was they started drafting Jewish boys who were then sent to the front just as cannon fodder. They didn't have any training, they weren't equipped, they didn't have ammunition, so they were cannon fodder simply for the Russians. In 1898, fearing for their lives, like many other Jewish families, the Socher family decided to flee Russia. And then they did something extraordinary. They didn't want their beloved Abram to give up his religious studies. So they approached the chazan, the cantor in the shtetl, and asked if Abram could stay with him while he completed his religious studies. And that cantor's name was, last name was Joelson. Well, about 9 months after the Socher family left Schrednik, the Joelson family decided that they had to emigrate as well. They had to flee. And they took the young Abram with them as they traveled by train across Europe to eventually arrive at Southampton in England. And at that time, there were really only two countries in the world that would accept Jewish refugees. There was the United States and South Africa. And there the Joelsons learnt that the Socher family had gone on to South Africa. The synagogue there had, they used to leave messages, and that's when they found out. So the Joelson family was going to go on to America. They put Dad on a cargo ship in the livestock hold, and livestock ships were pretty popular, as we'll learn a little bit later in his life, and the ship headed for Cape Town. By the way, it's interesting to note that one of the Joelson children became a very famous entertainer in America, and that was Al Jolson. Anyway, the young Abram Socher arrived in Cape Town, where once again at the synagogue he learnt that his family had moved north to a village called Rustenburg. And at that time, the British were fighting a war with the Boers, the Boer War. And the British Army hired young Abram to lead donkeys transporting supplies from Cape Town to the Transvaal province where the war was being fought. So Dad dragged donkeys carrying munitions, etc., and he was paid in food. So after many weeks or months, I don't know how long, Dad arrived in Rustenburg, where he learned that only a week earlier his father had died. So Dad was now left to take care of a family consisting of a mother, 6 sisters, and a crippled brother, Charles, after whom my sister Charlene was eventually was named. Charles died a few years later. Another older brother, Harry, deserted the family pretty soon after their father died. So it was really left up to Dad to take care of the family. His first job that he got was delivering meat for a butcher shop. And then he managed to persuade the owner to let him work a second shift as a meat cutter at night, which was a tough existence, delivering in the day and cutting meat at night. Now, according to his sisters, after a few very tough years when they lived in abject poverty, though they were used to it from the shtetl, Dad somehow managed to provide quite well for his entire family. Unfortunately, I was never able to find out exactly how Dad somehow managed to support a pretty large family, and his sisters were, to say the least, reluctant to say anything. They pleaded ignorance. They didn't know. However, it seems almost certain that Dad made his money smuggling and or rustling cattle. And that was how he was able to take care, support his family. And later on I'll tell a little story which does provide the clues to reaching the conclusion that he was a that he smuggled or stole cattle, or both. Other than 1 year or less than 1 year studying with the Rebbe in the shtetl, Dad had no education at all, nothing. He managed to teach himself to read and write in English and Afrikaans. However, he did have a talent for picking up languages. And he spoke English, he spoke Afrikaans, and he spoke Tswana, a native tongue in that area. His home language was Yiddish, and his English and Afrikaans were spoken with a very, very strong Yiddish accent. For those you might have heard of Jackie Mason. He was Jackie Mason on steroids, very, very thick accent. Now, the reason that Dad married so late in life, and when I say late in life, he was in his 50s, was because Jewish tradition required that a singular head of family could not marry until all his sisters were married. And in his case, this proved to be quite a problem. And what his problem really was that each of his sisters was really a lot uglier than the next. And the only way he could get them married was by providing a living to prospective husbands. And that's what he set out to do. And I have been able to trace that he set up or bought businesses for the men who became his brothers-in-law, and those businesses included a service station, a couple of butcher shops, an orange farm, a general store, and he was finally able to land husbands for each of his sisters. By the way, all his sisters were fantastic cooks. Meals cooked by his sisters were well worth it. Now let me try to tell the story of Thaba Zimbi, which played a big part. Bechuanaland is a landlocked country now known as Botswana, and at that time was a British protectorate. Bechuanaland had a really prosperous cattle ranching industry, which Britain, the colonial power, exploited by legislating that all beef, all livestock, had to be exported to Britain. They would export it alive and slaughter when they got to England. Sales to South Africa, where beef commanded significantly higher prices, were strictly forbidden by the British government, and the South African government complied. At that time, South Africa was part of the British Commonwealth and really was under British influence. And between the two governments, they enforced tight control over the border to ensure that Bechuanaland cattle didn't get to South African markets and so they could go cheap to provide cheap beef in Britain. So here you had the cattle in Bechuanaland being sold for a lot less than South African livestock. This ensured low prices for the beef in Britain, and it protected the South African ranchers from very efficient competition. Victor Verster, who was Dad's best friend, eventually told me how Dad used to ride on horseback into Bechuanaland, where he bought cattle from local farmers and then smuggled them back across the Bechuanaland South African border into South Africa, where the markets generated significantly higher prices. In fact, Victor described how Dad and his black workers used to tie thorn bushes to the tails of cattle to create dust storms so that British troops couldn't see them, would have difficulty shooting them. And there apparently were times when they did come under fire. According to a cousin of mine, Izzy Pleskis, his mother, Aunt Lizzie, had told him that around 1920, the mid-20s, 1925, Dad had been arrested and charged with being in possession of stolen cattle. The charges had been summarily dismissed by the local magistrate, who, by fortunate coincidence, happened to be Dad's best friend, Victor Verster. So Dad walked in and Victor threw out the charges, but apparently it did get some newspaper coverage, and which is how my Aunt Lizzie and her son found out about it. By the way, Victor Verster was a really talented man who went on to become the head of South Africa's prison system, as well as managing the country's armaments industry. The prison which housed Nelson Mandela in the last 7 years of his imprisonment was named after Victor Verster, the Victor Verster prison, out of respect for the work that he had done to modernize the South African prison system. It still was pretty brutal. Well, apparently, let me get back to the story of Thabazimbi. Apparently the cattle smuggling or rustling business was going very well, with one problem. The distance that the cattle had to be driven from Bechuanaland to the markets in South Africa, and those markets would have been in Rustenburg, or better still to Johannesburg, which was 90 miles or so away from Rustenburg. There was a great distance, and the cattle would lose weight and condition during these long drives. Losing weight and condition meant that they sold for less. So Dad figured out that he needed some place where the cattle could rest, recuperate, put on weight, regain their condition. So he bought a farm midway between Rustenburg and the Bechuanaland border. I believe the name of the farm when he bought it was called the Colorado Ranch. Where that would come from, I really don't know. And he paid 2 shillings. There were 20 shillings to a British pound, which was the currency then, per morgan. And a morgan was just under 2.5 acres. And apparently he bought approximately 500 morgan. It's, I guess, about 1,200 acres. Now, the farm worked very, very well. Cattle were driven from Bechuanaland to the farm, where they stayed until they were in peak condition and when the markets were favourable. And then they were moved to the markets either in Rustenburg or in Johannesburg. So it was really working very well for Dad. Now, before wristwatches became popular, which happened to be in the 1920s, all watches were pocket or fob watches, which had covers and were attached to a chain and usually kept in what was known as a fob pocket. Well, sometime around 1916, Dad, who was, I guess, a bit of a playboy at the time, bought the very first wristwatch which was sold in Rustenburg. And he was incredibly proud of this modern and very expensive piece of timepiece or jewelry. He loved it, his watch. And the first time he arrived at the farm wearing his wristwatch, it stopped working. And when he got back to Rustenburg, he had to send it all the way back to Switzerland to be repaired. It had to go from Rustenburg to Johannesburg, down to Cape Town by rail, and then by ship to Europe till it got back to Switzerland, where it was repaired. And the round trip took more than 3 months. Pretty slow process. Well, anyway, Dad was very happy to have his watch back working. Unfortunately for him, the next time he went to the farm, the watch stopped again. Dad was very disappointed that his prized possession had let him down again and was broken once again. He had to go through to send the watch back to Switzerland to be repaired. Months later, the watch made it back to Rustenburg, and Dad was thrilled. He was delighted to be able to wear his wristwatch. He heads off to Bechuanaland and then to the farm, and which was a couple of weeks later, and before he visited the farm again, and bingo, the watch once again stopped. Dad was more than upset, and he now finally seen a link between the watch stopping when he went to the farm. And he began to think that the farm must be jinxed. Something evil about the farm. Anyway, once again, he sent the watch back to Switzerland, and it arrived back months later. Dad was happy again, but a few weeks later, he visited the farm, and the watch stopped. Dad was now finally convinced that the farm was the source of his bad luck, and what he decided to do was sell the farm. He saw this as some jinx. Many years later, I found out that the name of that farm turned out to be Thabazimbi, and Thabazimbi in the native law is the mountain of iron, and in the 1930s, Thabazimbi became the site of one of the world's largest iron ore mines. It was just a mountain of iron, and all they had to do was take away the mountain, in which they built a railroad to get it to the ports. It was incredible. So when I found this out, and the Dad had once owned Thabazimbi, I went to him and I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you realize how wealthy this family would have been if you hadn't sold the farm?" And he kind of looked at me, and he then told me the long story about moving the cattle and buying the farm, and the sad story of his watch and how it stopped working whenever he went to the farm. That's how I learned the full story. And Dad concluded this. He said to me, "Ivan, I bought the farm for 2 shillings a morgen. And I sold it a few years later for 2 shillings and 6pence a morgen. So you see, I made a profit." Ivan, it's always good to make a profit. It is, and not lose money. Losing money, not so good. So I made a profit. It was a good deal, and it worked for the cattle. But Ivan, do you know what the very best thing was? The very, very best of it. After I sold the farm, after I sold it, the watch worked. So it was a good decision, a profit, and the watch worked. And this became one of the most important lessons that I ever learned from Dad. And the lesson was simple. Always find the good in every situation, and never, never look back with regret. If you can find something positive, don't look back with regret. And this wonderful lesson has served me well over the years. Myra and I have often had occasion when mistakes have been made and things weren't quite right to look at each other shake heads and say, but the watch worked. And as we reflect on many of the less perfect decisions we've made, and there have been a ton of them, and whenever things look grim, I remembered that the watch worked. From Victor Verster, I also learned that my father had been an amazingly talented athlete. He'd been an amateur boxing champion at the provincial level, who'd fought under the pseudonym or the Fighting Dutchman, so that his family wouldn't know what he was doing. They would have been terribly ashamed of an activity like boxing, just not for a nice Jewish boy. That would not have been very good. He was also an incredible horseman. Mustn't forget, in those days there weren't cars, and he'd been driving cattle, horses, all the stuff to Bechuanaland, and had been on horseback. And he ended up being an international polo player, represented South Africa against the Argentine when they were touring South Africa. He was also an amazing hunter. He once, as a bet, went out with his dogs hunting pointers, and with 100 shotgun shells, came back with 105 birds shot on the wing. These aren't shot on the ground, they're shot in the air. What happened out of these demonstrations of great skills was that his hunting prowess had come to the notice of some very wealthy gold mining magnates who enjoyed hunting. And they approached Dad and said to him, look, we got a deal for you. Why don't we buy a farm where we'll hunt in the season, and you manage the farm, look after the farm, in return for which you can graze cattle, no charge to you. You get the benefit of the cattle. So what would happen is, in the hunting season, Dad oversaw all the hunting activities. Also made sure that they had all the booze they needed, and took care of the whole camp where they came. And they rewarded him with shares in new mining companies, public offerings that they were taking to market. So they'd automatically just count him in for some shares. Also, I learned that Dad had fought in German Southwest Africa during World War I in the so-called Boer Rebellion. And his platoon actually captured the leader of the rebellion, General, I think his name was Christian de Wet, and Dad had protected de Wet from being beaten up by angry soldiers. So Dad had military experience as well. So he was a remarkable man, my father, and I was blessed to have a man like that in my life. Well, that was a brief history of my dad's life. There isn't a lot more I know about it. However, I do want to talk a little bit about advice that I got from my father. Now, Dad gave me very, very few pieces of advice. However, the few pieces of advice he did offer proved to be incredibly valuable to me. And let me tell you the advice. Dad always said it was important in business to understand what a good deal was. And Dad taught me, as he put it, a deal can only be a good deal if it's good for all parties to the deal. If there are two parties in a deal, it must be good for both. If there are three parties to a deal, it must be good for all three. If it's good for two, but bad or not so good for another, then it's a bad deal. And he stressed that one should never ever do a bad deal. It'll bother you a lot. And he then said that you should also think about written contracts when you do a deal. Dad's limited education meant he had real difficulty comprehending legal nuances inherent in contractual documents, and recognizing this deficiency, Dad would only sign a contract after, as he put it, he'd stared into the eyes of the other parties and they'd look back at him, because he believed that if you did that and talked about what you understand the deal or the contract was all about, that would be true agreement. It's people, not the piece of paper, that counts. Dad said, that way in your heart you'll always know what was really meant by the parties, and you'll act properly. You won't run to the document and try and find an advantage for yourself that might be made because other parties didn't understand it that way. And he said, so will all the other parties to the agreement. Now, I actually found this advice to be invaluable. Before signing any contract, I always looked into the eyes of the other parties and made sure we all were on the same wavelength, on the same page, irrespective of what the legal document might say or how it could be interpreted by smart lawyers. And I have to tell you, it actually, the simplistic, naive, you can say, approach really worked well for both Dad and for me throughout our lives. For me, and I guess for Dad as well, it was important to see, sense and feel what the other parties to the deal understood, rather than to try to interpret or seek advantages from the complicated words that the lawyers generate so happily and, of course, send you bills for it. Sadly, this approach probably won't work in today's world, where the sense of honor in business, I'm not sure, really does exist the same way. Other things, most important lesson, one of them from Dad, was promises. Dad's advice on promises was both proved to be wise and I guess humorous. I'll never forget it. He said to me, Ivan, Ivan, my son, the worst thing a man can do is to break a promise. Never ever break a promise. You can't imagine, this is a skanda, a shame. So you must never ever break a promise. Die before you break a promise. Let me repeat, never ever break a promise. Breaking a promise is a große Schande, a huge shame. It's if you break a promise, neshama, you will leiden. Your soul will suffer if you break a promise. Never forget that. A Mensch will sterben before he'll break a promise. An honorable person will die before he will ever break a promise. After a long pause, and this is after listening to the drama of all this, he then said to me, he leant forward and he said, "Na, Ivan, mein Kind, Ivan, my child, is breaking a promise is such a terrible thing to do. Listen carefully, Ivan. Don't make many promises." Well, I didn't make many promises in my life, but promises I made and managed to keep are important. Our big promise. Dad was absolutely convinced that the racial prejudice and the abuse that blacks in South Africa suffered under the apartheid regime, it was cruel, it was obscene, it was unforgivable. He believed that it was inevitable that a bloody uprising would bring apartheid to an end. He didn't see any other way it would end. And that the blacks would justifiably take revenge on the white population, and there would be a bloodbath. And he couldn't see any way out of that. You couldn't have 5 million people ruling 30 million the way they did. So Dad urged my sister Charlene and Maya and I to leave South Africa. Anytime he had an opportunity, he begged us to. As he was nearing the end of his life, he finally asked Maya and I to promise and to move his beloved grandsons overseas. He did not want to see Rowan and Larry serving in white military suppressing blacks. And given the state of his life, it was impossible for us to refuse this request. So we actually solemnly promised that we would make sure that Rowan and Larry would be educated and live, and that we would emigrate, we would live abroad. Dad was clearly relieved that he was able to elicit this promise from Maya and I, because he believed, after giving me the advice, that he could trust me never to break a promise. You know, after all, he told me not to make many promises and to never, never, ever break a promise. So he had a level of confidence that I would. And we managed to keep our biggest promise. But yeah, I really should comment, I shouldn't take credit for that, because after Dad, we moved from Durban to Johannesburg, where I lucked into joining IBM, selling punch card equipment and primitive computer systems. And within a few years, I left IBM and started my own computer company, which seemed to be doing, it was called Computer Advances, which business went well. And we were living a privileged life. We were waited on by several live-in servants. We wanted for nothing. And I kept putting off any decision. However, Myra kept reminding me of the promise we'd made Dad. She really pushed me, and also I think she maybe, I didn't want to see the situation as clearly as she did. And also I was realizing that Rowan and Larry would be conscripted into the South African Army in 5 or 6 years, and then they'd be forced to fight when the time came. So we did appreciate the need to leave South Africa. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, because I was enjoying the good life, so I kept procrastinating. But Myra's reminders and urging became more insistent, and she eventually shamed me into action. So I then developed a business plan that would enable us to leave South Africa, and it wasn't quite as simple as one would think, mainly because South Africa had very, very tight restrictions on currency, and you couldn't take your money out of the country. Anyway, we managed to keep that promise to Dad. Another promise made and kept was when Dad was dying. He also asked me to promise that I would take care of my mother after he was gone. And I made the promise. I guess I never fully appreciated what it might take and what it would cost in financial terms to keep this promise. As Dad's health had declined and dementia had set in, he hadn't been able to work for, I guess, the last 10 or 15 years of his life. So he and Mom had lived on savings. I mean, he used to go down to the office, but he didn't do any work, and certainly didn't have an income in the last years of his life. Now, by the time Dad died, almost all their savings had been depleted. So keeping his promise meant that we ended up having to take care of Mom for 30 years or so. That was a long time. A lot of people don't stay married for 30 years. Anyway, when we left South Africa, Mom arrived in Irvine, where we'd moved to, only a few weeks after we had moved, and she never went back to South Africa. So we ended up buying houses for her in Irvine, California, in Dallas, Texas, and New York. We paid her all the house and car, all her expenses, which turns out running two households is a costly proposition. Then when we built a home on Hilton Head Island, we built a mother-in-law suite so Mom could live with us instead of having to have a second home. When we moved to Georgetown, Mom lived with us in the townhouse that we had in Georgetown until she fell down the stairs of our townhouse. So we then bought a condominium in the Jefferson retirement home for her in Ballston. When her Alzheimer's disease worsened so that she couldn't stay in the retirement community, we moved her into our apartment and took care of her until she died in 2001. By the way, she was 89 when she died. So we kept another promise, and it was an important one to keep. And by the way, today we still own the condo at the Jefferson, which we somehow don't seem to be able to sell. I know that my dad loved me without any reservations and with all his heart. He was very proud of me. However, his generation didn't express their emotions verbally or, for that matter, physically, and he never once ever told me that he loved me. I can't tell you how much I wish I could have heard those words from Dad. I wish I could have heard Dad say, "Son, I love you." This explains that why, whenever I see my sons Raoul and Larry, I try to remember to say, "Raoul, my son, I love you." Or, "Larry, my son, I love you." And don't forget to tell your family that you love them. Let me say it again now. Raoul, my son, I love you. You'll never know how much. And Larry, my son, I love you more than anything else. Let me talk a little bit about my mother. My mother had an incredibly hard youth. My mother's father, Abraham Gabaholz, was born in Warsaw, Poland, and her mother, Esther, was born in Manchester, England. They immigrated to South Africa where in the early 1900s, where they met and married. When my mother, Rita Socher, nee Gabaholz, was 12 or 13, her mother fell ill and was hospitalized. For 6 months, her mother lingered before dying. She was in hospital for 6 months, and my mother, Rita, visited her every single day. It was within walking distance of their home. Then, one day when Mom was about 16, she came home from school and found her father hanging from a beam in the hall of their home, apparently very depressed by the loss of his wife, and he also had been unable to earn enough to really care for financially for his daughter, and my grandfather committed suicide, which must have had a devastating effect on Mom. Mom then lived with an uncle, aunt, and three cousins. Her cousins were boys. The Belcher family, who were really not happy to have the responsibility of having to care for my mother. I have really good reason to believe that the youngest cousin, Cyril, sexually abused my mother. And it's a terrible thing to say, but I believe that to be the case. At the age of 18, after matriculating from high school, Mom went to England, where she actually danced in the chorus line of the Sadler's Wells Ballet Company. And at the age of about 25, she returned to Johannesburg, where she opened a dance studio under her stage name, which was Rita Garrett. You couldn't have a stage name of Gubba Holtz. And I think she did moderately well with her dance studio. Scarred by a very traumatic youth, Mom had many psychological problems. Thankfully, she met and married Dad, who loved her and protected her and cared for her and put up with her idiosyncrasies. Sadly, she never really recovered from the loss of their first child, Jennifer, my sister, who died of polio in 1948. And I'll talk about that later. When we lived in Georgetown, Mom went daily to Georgetown University Hospital, where she loved sitting and holding AIDS babies. And the hospital, Georgetown Hospital, recognized a very valuable contribution that she made. It also gave her a great deal of comfort and pleasure. My mom was a difficult person, but she certainly loved her family beyond anything else. And Mom, I miss you too. Well, another Socher family from my side of the family, a big surprise. My half-sister. Sometime in the early 1970s, I can't remember exactly which year it was, I was surprised to be called at my office by a young woman, Margaret, who told me that she was my half-sister. And Margaret was anxious to meet. So I arranged that Charlene and I to meet, and we met her at a private home where she was staying. When we walked into the room, one look at Margaret, and there was no doubt in my mind that she was our half-sister. She looked like my dad. She had so many of Dad's features, including a wonderful smile. It was also clear that Margaret's mother almost certainly was not white. And at that time in South Africa, under the apartheid laws, sex between whites or even was a criminal offence and was in fact harshly punished. Margaret was about a year younger than my sister Charlene, and it was clear I was kind of surprised Margaret wanted to meet us and learn a little bit about her father, understandably, and she asked absolutely nothing more of us, just to meet. We spent some time with her telling her about our father, and Margaret told us that she'd been adopted by a Jewish family and had been sent to a boarding school where she was educated. Knowing my father, I suspected, and in fact I'm pretty sure, that he probably arranged for the adoption, going to a Jewish family like that, and almost certainly probably provided financial support. Now, Charlene and I did not want to have to explain anything to our mother, who would undoubtedly have freaked out. So we said nothing and did not have any further contact with Margaret before we both emigrated from South Africa. I must tell you, it did bother me turning my back at that time on Margaret. My conscience bothered me. It seemed that it did not seem to be moral to be turning my back on a half-sister. But anyway, in June 2008, I got a call from Leanne Morgan from England. And she identified herself as a daughter of Margaret. And Leanne, the reason for her calling was that Leanne had been trying to arrange for her sister Maxine to move to England, and had learned that if they could prove that their grandfather was from Lithuania, Maxine would have a preferential status in the European Union, as Lithuania was now part of the Union. So I said I'd do whatever I could, and what I did was I scanned the documents I had, and whatever documents I had of my late dad, mailed them to her, and I understand that they did help Maxine get residency. In 2009, Myra, our daughter-in-law Nancy, and our granddaughter Ellie met up with my sister Charlene in Paris. Myra happened to tell Charlene about having been contacted by our half-sister's daughter Leanne. Charlene was very upset that I hadn't told her about these contacts with our half-sister's family. And Charlene, then, without saying anything to me, and after I hadn't said anything to her, so it's understandable, established contact directly with Margaret and her daughters Leanne and Maxine. And Charlene invited Margaret and Leanne to her daughter Carmela's wedding, which I didn't know. Actually, Myra and I were booked to attend our niece's wedding when Myra had to undergo surgery to remove a cancerous growth in her lung. So we really had to have somebody at the wedding, so I asked Raul to attend in our place. And Raul and his daughter Dina went to Luxembourg, where, much to their surprise, they met Margaret and Leanne. We hadn't told them anything we hadn't told our children anything about my half-sister. So they were really surprised. Raul and Adina really fell in love with their newfound family, who are fantastic people. Raul then went to Leanne's wedding, which was in London, and at Raul's urging, Margaret and Leanne came to our granddaughter Jordana's bat mitzvah in 2013, and it was absolutely wonderful. Margaret and I, after so many years, it was fantastic to be able to form a loving relationship with my half-sister Margaret. She really has tremendous Socher genes, and she really is a Socher. Now, Margaret and I talk regularly, and all I can say, she's an absolutely amazing person. After having a very tough childhood, she married, had 3 beautiful daughters, Leanne, Maxine, and Birgit. After an unexpected and I think unwanted divorce, Margaret oversaw the upbringing and education of her daughters. Leanne and Maxine are medical doctors who've both specialized, and Birgit is an accountant. They are all very accomplished and charming women. Raoul and Danielle took the kids over on vacation and spent time with Maxine and her family. I have to admit that my conscience still bothers me that I turned my back and walked away from Margaret when I left South Africa. I know I've been forgiven. I don't think she ever held it against me, and we now do have a loving relationship.
Polio, 1956. This is the way it looked. This is the way it sounded. You are listening to the breath of life as it is pumped by these tank respirators called iron lungs.
Well, our family was hit by tragedy. In February 1948, a polio epidemic broke out in Johannesburg. On Monday, March the 1st, I fell ill and was diagnosed with polio. As the Johannesburg Fever Hospital, the isolation hospital, was already filled with polio cases, the only space was at the Children's Hospital, and I was admitted into the Children's Hospital. I was put into an iron lung, which allowed me to breathe and actually kept me alive. On Tuesday, March the 2nd, the next day, my older sister Jenny, she was Jennifer Zina Esther Socher, fell ill. And on the Wednesday, my sister Charlene, at the age of 2, fell ill with polio as well. So all 3 children were stricken with polio. As all the hospitals were full, Charlene had to be treated at home. On Thursday, March the 4th, Jenny died at the age of 9. Mom and Dad buried Jenny March 5th and drove directly from the West Park Cemetery to visit me in Children's Hospital. They peered through the glass windows of the sealed ward and managed to somehow hide their grief for fear of upsetting me, as I was in critical condition and it really was touch and go as to whether I was going to live or die. I'll never know how they managed to smile and laugh in an attempt to keep my spirits up. They'd come straight from the cemetery. I certainly doubt whether in similar circumstances I could have hidden unbearable grief. It marked them for life, no question. For me, living in an iron lung was an absolutely terrifying experience. I was an energetic 7-year-old. There were, in our glass enclosed ward, there were 8 iron lungs, each with a child in. And the very worst part was watching the pumps that were in the corners and hearing the clanking sound as each iron lung's pump mechanism moved, relentlessly up and down, up and down. These pumps went to keep the pressure moving in the iron lungs. Actually, for many, many years afterwards, I suffered from the same recurring nightmare. I was being chased by an iron lungs pump, and I'd run around screaming until one of my parents managed to catch me and wake me up. Sadly, I also remember, and I clearly remember, dead bodies being removed from iron lungs on 2 occasions. And if you go to the Johannesburg cemetery in the children's section, you can see the devastating toll it took on the Jewish community. Then, after spending a month or so in an iron lung, I recovered enough to go home. As my leg muscles had atrophied and weakened, I couldn't stand or walk without leg braces and crutches. And the treatments that I had to go through consisted of, they would dip blankets in boiling water and then place them on my back and legs. This was done several times a day and was, to say the least, very painful. I dreaded those treatments. Then therapists exercised my legs trying to get them moving again. As to be expected with young kids, my neighborhood and school pals, buddies, quickly forgot me. It wasn't much fun playing with a kid who couldn't walk or run or play any of the games. And my life was very lonely as I worked to regain the strength in my legs. Very, very lonely. However, one friend remained loyal. His name was Mervyn, subsequently got the famous nickname Rocky. Mervyn Rocky Muravit. Rocky visited me regularly, almost every day, and kept my spirits up. No other kid visited, but Rocky did, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Rocky. I love him dearly and have never forgotten his kindness. Well, doctors then advised my parents that swimming could help rebuild muscles in my legs. So my parents built a swimming pool, and my mother made me swim laps every single day. And the swimming certainly did work to build up my leg muscles. Actually, in winter, when it was too cold to swim outdoors, she drove me to the Hillbrow Club, which had an indoor pool, and she repeated the forcing me to do the laps. Yeah, I gotta say, Mom, with Dad's encouragement, he encouraged, was merciless. She forced me to keep swimming lap after lap after lap. Actually, to this day, I hate swimming. The Socher's family experience with polio brought about a major change in another way. Something called graveside schnoddering. Schnoddering in Yiddish means begging. In Johannesburg, all Jewish funerals were, and I still believe are, conducted by the Johannesburg Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Helping Hand Friends and Burial Society. The Chevra in Johannesburg did, and probably still does, a wonderful job in the Jewish community. The Chevra supports the Jewish orphanage, it supports the Jewish aged home, it supports Jewish handicapped, and it has done wonderful work. One of the Chevra's most successful fundraising techniques was this schnoddering, begging at the graveside. Each person, male, women didn't participate, attending the funeral would walk up to the rabbi or the chazan, the cantor, in front of the open grave before the coffin was lowered into the grave, and they would tell the rabbi or the chazan how much he or she was schnoddering or donating to the Chevra in memory of the person being buried. The name of the donor and the amount would then be loudly called out so that everybody at the funeral would know exactly how much was given by the person. This public announcement of donors' names and the amount of the donation shamed people into larger donations. In fact, people gave more than they really could afford or really wanted to. It was a very, very effective fundraising technique. While arranging Jenny's funeral, Dad visited the rabbi and he asked the rabbi how much he thought that the rabbi thought schnoddering would raise at Jenny's funeral. The rabbi thought it would be around £5,000, which was the currency then, which I guess must be about $25,000 in today's money. Wanting to avoid having to stand for the hour or so while the schnoddering took place, Dad told the rabbi that he would give the rabbi £5,000 if the rabbi wouldn't schnodder, and the rabbi agreed to. And Dad wanted to get away from the funeral to visit me in hospital, so the rabbi agreed. Well, when the rabbi saw how large the crowd was attending the funeral and that there were quite a few very wealthy members of the Jewish community and actually Afrikaans community that come to the funeral, he decided that the Chevra could raise more than the £5,000 by schnoddering. And so, without batting an eyelid, he broke the promise he had made to Dad. And apparently it took nearly 1.5 hours for everybody to contribute to a schnodder, and they raised £10,000. So, in a financial sense, it was, for the Chevra, it was a good decision, a punishing decision for my parents. Dad never, ever forgave the Orthodox rabbi or the synagogue or the Chevra Kadisha which conducted the service. Immediately resigned from the congregation and abandoned all religious affiliations. And when you think about it, you really can't blame him. A couple of little ones I'd like to mention is my mother When we moved to Georgetown, Mom spent several days every week at the Georgetown University Hospital, where she held and loved babies that were suffering from AIDS. This gave her something very meaningful to do, and the hospital recognized her contributions to comforting these sick and suffering babies. And she was proud of it, and I'm proud of her too for that. Anyway, before talking about a little bit about Myra's family, the Phillips family, I should mention something that was very real for both our families. It's interesting to note that both families had burning desires to own land, in particular farmland. The reason for that, this was that both in Lithuania, where my father and his family came from, and Poland, where Myra's parents came from, Jews had been barred from ever owning land. So many Jews who immigrated to South Africa, and I guess the same thing was in the United States, had a very deep desire to own land and to farm. And that was something that our families really did have in common. Both our fathers bought farms, and I have very fond memories of spending time at Dad's farms that I remember. One was called Vlakplaas, another was called Klipfontein, which were about 10 miles from a little town called, a tiny village called Northam. There was also a beautiful citrus farm which was managed by his sister Sarah and her husband. That farm was beautiful. Myra, I can remember taking Myra there, where she learnt of the wonders of my aunt's cooking. And of course there was Tabazimbi, which Dad had owned, but just for a few years. Okay, let's talk about Myra's family. Myra's dad, Ivan Phillips, loved his farm Dorisville, which was near Brantford, just outside Bloemfontein. Dorisville was named after Myra's older sister Doris. Now, Myra's parents, Ivan Phillips, his name before changing to Phillips was Pszalski, Piscczalski, I think. And Chanela, his wife, Myra's mother, was Nina Luzhansky, and they'd both been born in Białystok, Poland. However, they met for the very first time, and I think it was in Bloemfontein, South Africa, in the early 1930s, mid-1930s, after leaving Poland. Myra's father's parents, Ivan's parents, and his sister Faye were reasonably well off when they lived in Białystok. And Myra's father had received a pretty good education at what he referred to as a gymnasium, which did give him a solid educational basis, unlike my dad, who had none. Chaneli, his wife, together with her older brother Shmulki and her older sister Sarah, was sent to safety by their parents, who stayed behind in Białystok and were killed in the Holocaust by Hitler. Now, in Białystok, the Luzhansky, they changed the name to Lee, family was very, very, very poor. Apparently lived in a tiny basement and often survived by eating discarded potato peels. Well, Ivan and Chanela met and married. They started a tiny sewing business which supplied a local store which was owned by a distant relative, a cousin. However, the outbreak of World War II saw their clothing business boom. They built a factory quickly, and they manufactured primarily uniforms for the South African Army, and proved to be a very lucrative business. They also had the rights to an American cloth manufacturer. Well, they made a ton of money in that war and post-war period, and built a mansion in a suburb of Durban, Eskom, which they named Ivanhoe after Myra's dad. Ganali had really been scarred by memories of her dismal home in Bialystok, and was determined to have lots and lots of space. So this house was enormous. In fact, Myra's bedroom was so big that when we took a baseball team from Wits down to Durban to play baseball, 14 members of the team slept in this one room, Myra's bedroom. Now, Doris, Myra's oldest sister, was born in 1933. Jeanette, next, was born 6 years later in 1939, big gap. And Myra was born another 6 years later in 1945. Now, Ivan Phillips really wanted a son very, very badly. And 4 years later, Leon was born. Sadly, Leon died at the very young age of 45 of heart disease. Now, equally sad at this time, Myra's sister Jeanette is suffering from temporal frontal lobe dementia and can no longer speak or communicate at all. And considering that Jeanette was a world-renowned pathologist, it's been very, very tough for her family to see her, watch her decline. And she's now really just living a vegetative state almost. Ganali was a most amazing woman. She was very short. She wasn't more than, I would guess, 4'9" tall. She was also very, very plump, actually very, very fat. Ivan, Myra's father, showered her with furs and jewelry. He adored her. However, he wanted her to have everything the best. So she wasn't really impressed by the furs and diamonds that he wanted her to wear, and she could walk around often dragging fur stoles on the ground behind her. Ganali was an outgoing, very, very warm person who people fell in love with. While Ganali didn't care at all what people thought of her, her husband Ivan was very, very conscious of social position, and he really worried about what people thought of him. Actually, a lot like my mother. My dad and Myra's mother really didn't care what people thought. There are some truly wonderful stories about Ivan, and in particular Ganali. For example, let me tell you this little story. Ivan and Ganali's first grandchild was Diane, Doris's daughter. The second was Wendy, Doris's second daughter. Then Jeanette had a daughter. Their first child was Jackie. So now, having had 3 daughters before finally having a son, Ganali and Ivan feared that, particularly Ivan, that they might never have a grandson. Anyway, Myra was expecting, and they had big hopes of finally being able to welcome a grandson. Myra went into labor, and which dragged on and on and on. And I actually spent 32 stressful hours with Ganali in the waiting room waiting for Raoul to be born. In those days, husbands didn't go into delivery. I'll never forget how Ganali lost her temper with the OB-GYN guy who was a family friend, when he visited and told us that Myra was many, many hours away from giving birth and that he was going to head off to a concert. But we shouldn't worry, the baby wasn't going to be born while he was at the concert. Hanela freaked out. She immediately rushed to the payphone and called her husband, and she screamed at him. She screamed, Ivan, this doctor's not damn good. We got to get a doctor from Johannesburg to fly down from Johannesburg. We can't trust this man. Over the other side of the phone, when he pointed out that the last flight had already left Johannesburg, and Hanela screamed at him, Ivan, I don't care, buy a goddamn plane. She was determined that she was really worried and she very excitable. Well, eventually the next day, Jaime Berkowitz, Doris's husband, our brother-in-law, who was in on the delivery, came out of the delivery room with a broad grin on his face to announce that a son had been born. Hanela was beside herself. She was so excited. And she knew how much it meant to her husband Ivan, so she rushed to the payphone to call him to give him this incredibly wonderful news. And I kind of trailed on behind her, and I watched her as she was very excited, but I watched her dial the wrong number. And when I tried to point out the mistake, she said, leave me alone, what are you trying to do? Shut up! And you couldn't argue. Well, anyway, when somebody answered the phone, Hanela, obviously believing she was talking to the factory switchboard operator, asked, put me through to Mr. Phillips. I need to talk to Mr. Phillips. And well, when this didn't happen, for a very, very obvious reason, Hanela screamed, listen, damn you, woman, you recognize you are fired. And I took the phone, clicked down the phone, and got through to Ivan. It was a matter of great joy. Anyway, another story involves the birth of our other son, Larry. When Larry was born, his bris, that's the circumcision, could not be performed at the hospital because he had a touch of jaundice. So the bris had to be delayed. Now this absolutely delighted Hanela and Ivan because it allowed them to hold the event in their home on a Sunday when they could invite all of Durban's Jewish community to celebrate. And they knew everybody. The Jewish community wasn't huge, but the Phillips family was really well known. Now, my father-in-law, Ivan, wanted the Moyle, who'd circumcised their son Leon, to do the bris. They believed he was the best. Unfortunately, the Moyle was suffering from cancer, had retired, and he wasn't doing brises anymore. But my father-in-law Ivan promised to pay for the Moyle to move to Israel, if he did this favor and bris Larry. And the Moyle agreed. It was the day came, and the Phillips' house was packed with noisy Jews, and as if they were any other kind of Jews, but all standing and talking. The men were downstairs in the enormous entrance hall to this home, and the women were draped along the spiral staircase which went up to the second floor where the baby was and Myra was. And at that time, men and women weren't allowed to attend. They had to be separated at religious ceremonies. Now, a table was ready, waiting for the baby, and the aging and this ailing Moyle stood behind, waiting to perform the surgery. Had his instruments laid out, and he was all set to go. Myra's sister Doris carried the baby, Larry, down the stairs to her father, my father-in-law Ivan, who was the sandek. The sandek's the guy who holds the baby's legs while the bris is performed. Ivan sat holding Larry on the table while the moil stared peacefully and fixedly out into the crowd, and he kept staring. Well, after a few minutes, quite a few minutes actually, people thought that the moil must be waiting for silence. There was a lot of shushing and hushing and shh, and eventually, to get Jews to quieten down as an effort, eventually the noise subsided. Now, even though it was now quiet enough that you could hear a pin drop, the moil kept staring into space. And eventually he looked around and he spoke up and he said, "Where's the baby?" Wait, I went white. I fell into a terrified state of shock. All I could visualize was my son's tiny penis being sliced off by this aging moil. Anyway, my brother-in-law Jaime, being a doctor, and the OB-GYN, whose name was actually Sammy Sachs now that I remember, immediately stepped forward and they stood closely on either side of him, holding their hands ready to grab if he made a mistake. I was shaking with fear as I watched the moil finally see the baby, which had been in front of him for maybe 5 minutes, and he went ahead with the prayers and the surgery. Now, Jaime and Sammy, their hands were inches away from his, ready to prevent a disaster. It's still to this day difficult for me to describe the panic and terror I felt. So it was quite an occasion, Larry's bris, pretty unforgettable. Thankfully, all went well and no intervention was needed. Another wonderful, for me, Chanela story. Now, when Myra, Larry and I moved from South Africa to the United States, we got off the plane in Los Angeles. Actually, it was July the 2nd, 1975. And I was greeted by a U.S. Marshal who served me with a lawsuit claiming theft of trade secrets. The lawsuit was brought in an effort by a competitor in an effort to slow down what they viewed to be a very competitive product. And my introduction to American law was very sudden and very intimidating. The lawsuit called for $6 million in damages. And anyway, in South Africa, the loser of a lawsuit has to pay the cost of both the winner and his own, and this discourages frivolous lawsuits. I was actually scared out of my mind, and clearly our whole future depended on not losing this lawsuit. And I engaged the services of a Delaware firm that specialized in trade secret litigation and was recognized as being probably the top firm for this type of litigation. But it was in Delaware, right the way across the country. Anyway, Chanela arrived for Raul's bar mitzvah. This was, I guess, about a year later. And I realized that I somehow would have to break the news of the lawsuit. So over dinner one evening, I told Chanela, "Mom, I've been sued." Her face went white, the blood drained out of her face, and she told me that she and her late husband had never sued anyone, nor had they ever been sued. She demanded, Ivan, what have you done? Why would they sue you? Well, it was very difficult to try to explain the different legal system in the US, that you could bring lawsuits just to delay people, hurt them. But she remained unconvinced, staring at me. And after a long while, she turned around to me and she said, Ivan, have you got a good lawyer? I replied, hey, Mom, and I was happy now, I was in good shape. I replied, hey, Mom, I have got the very best lawyers in the country. I pointed out that I'd gone all the way across the country to get the law firm that were the very best. So that was to be happy. She thought about this for quite a while, and a few minutes later she asked me, Ivan, have the people what's suing you got a good lawyer? I replied that I thought, yeah, they do have a good lawyer. He's a pretty smart guy. And after another long pause, as she tried to digest this, she said, Ivan, is your lawyer Jewish? After thinking a moment, I had to tell her that he wasn't. The idea that I'd hire. Anyway, my stomach now was in a knot because I knew what was coming. Ivan, is their lawyer Jewish? When I answered that he was, Chanala spoke her mind. Ivan, what have you done? Why did you do it? Ivan, you must give up. You must beg for the forgiveness. This is too terrible. Why would a Jewish lawyer sue a Jewish boy unless he was guilty? There's no way a Jewish lawyer would do that. It's just not possible. Ivan, I beg you, you've got to give up immediately. And then she turned to Myra and the truth came out. She said, Myra, we always told you that you married a rubbish, a gonef, a thief, a no goodnik. He's no good, this boy. Otherwise, why would he be sued by a Jewish lawyer? I'll also never forget the fact that when Ra was about 3 or 4, he fell into the family's swimming pool, and my father-in-law, Ivan, who couldn't swim at all, jumped in to try to save Ra. Thankfully, we managed to pull both my father-in-law and Ra out of the water, because he would have drowned and he would have done anything. He wasn't going to let his grandson drown. So my in-laws were very, very interesting people. My life has been marked by luck. More luck, tons and tons of luck. I was incredibly lucky to have lived my entire life in favorable times. Just consider that I was lucky enough to have been born white in South Africa at a time when the white population enjoyed privileged lives, albeit at the horrible expense of the black majority. My family and Myra's had several live-in servants who saw to our every need and desire. It was almost like living in plantation times in the US. That was really good life, although very cruel. I was lucky that my father and mother were loving and doting parents who spoiled me rotten. By the way, that's true of Myra's parents as well. I was lucky that we left South Africa less than a year before the Soweto uprising. Had we still been in South Africa, I would have been mobilized by the army and would have spent quite a bit of time having to fight with an all-white army to brutally suppress the black majority, the insurrection of the black majority. By pure luck, I stumbled into the computer industry in its earliest days when there was little competition, it was growing very rapidly, and it was easy to succeed as long as anybody tried. I worked for IBM, where I learned opportunities to start my own computer businesses, and that was pretty lucky. I was very lucky that when we arrived in the United States in 1975, it was the middle of a very deep recession. And then we were able to catch the economic upswing as the economy recovered. That made it possible to succeed fairly quickly. I was very lucky that I was never called on to fight in a war, other than a few forays at the outset of rioting in South Africa in 1960 after what was quite famous, the Sharpeville Massacre. There was an uprising in South Africa, and I got mobilized. I think above all, I was lucky to meet Myra, and that counted a lot. So my life has been marked by lots and lots of luck. Without a doubt, Myra was and is the very best thing that ever happened for me. Myra is a unique human being. She's highly intelligent, very beautiful, delightfully charming. She's a passionate person. She's loving, caring, and unselfish. I never cease to wonder what she ever saw in me. Without Myra's insistence and persistence, I have doubts as to whether we would have left South Africa and moved to the United States. And that would have made a huge difference to our lives, not in a good way. Certainly without her support and her encouragement, I certainly would have failed many, many tests in my life. When I was down, she certainly always picked me up. I've been very lucky that I've always been able to share my deepest feelings and doubts honestly with Myra. My weaknesses, she knows them all. Her advice and support through very good times and bad times have given me courage, determination, and above all, comfort as I had to address problems. Like overall, I think our life together has been a very good partnership, and a true partnership. Our love and our respect for each other has carried us through some very rocky, turbulent times, and has allowed us to deal with some tough problems. when Maya was diagnosed with lung cancer and underwent surgery to remove a lobe of her lung, I was terrified, absolutely terrified that she might die. I simply could not imagine life without her. Since my kidney transplant, Myra has micromanaged my health. Actually, she's done it throughout our life. Without her making sure that I take the correct drugs, etc., I would almost certainly be dead by now. I couldn't be relied on to effectively medicate myself. So I've been truly blessed to have been able to share my life with Myra, and I want her to know just how much I love her and appreciate her effort. I tell you a little more. This is be a little bit more humorous. My distinguished military career. In 1959, I won the only lottery I've ever won, and was drafted or conscripted into the South African Army. I was sent to the army base at Potchefstroom to undergo 11 months of basic training. And at that time, the South African Army was forced to rely on conscription, as it certainly was unable to recruit many men to join the permanent force. Well, my father's advice is shut your mouth, do what you're told, and get your training over with. Well, there was a Colonel Peter Coetzee. He was a very ambitious officer who truly believed that he could develop a program which would provide a steady influx of well-qualified, of course that meant white, the army was all white, manpower into the permanent force, people who would make the military their career. His idea was to sell conscripts on the idea of making the army a worthwhile career, an exciting and fulfilling career. That's what he found it to be. He believed that the way the sale would be made would be by exposing the conscripts to very exciting and adventurous military activities like flying aeroplanes, parachuting, parachute jumping, commando activities, etc. He thought it would be a very, very attractive proposition. Now, after about 10 weeks of basic training, which was not for me, I was very surprised and, I got to say, very nervous to be summoned to meet with Colonel Coetzee. So he laid out his plan and vision, told me that he was inviting me to be one of 12 conscripts from different backgrounds to form the first unit in his experimental program. I got to tell you, I looked at him, and my dad had warned me, don't volunteer for anything because you'll be disappointed. Now, by the way, he told me that I had been chosen as the Jew in this diverse, but of course, all white groups. Being a Jew was why I was chosen. Now, after receiving several assurances that my training would not be extended, in other words, after 11 months I was going to be out of there, and that I would not be under any obligation to enlist in the permanent force, I nervously signed up for this test program. Well, this turned out to be a great decision, another example of my luck. The 12 of us were moved into separate quarters where we were each given our own private room. This was much, much better than living in a stinking barrack shed with 29 other dumb soldiers. Within 1 week, we realized that Colonel Coetzee had put his career on the line with this innovative program. He simply couldn't afford to let the program fail. And as soon as we realized how vulnerable his position was, we began to make demands, both reasonable demands as well as a lot of unreasonable requests. Whenever he balked, we threatened to leave the program, knowing full well that he just couldn't allow that to happen, and he was forced to cave in, which made for a very leisurely and fun-filled, actually, training. And the rest of our training was relaxed, it was easy, and it was fun. We were exposed to all aspects of the army in the hope that this would spark our interest. This included tank maneuvers, artillery, parachute jumping, air observation corps, flying old Tiger Moth biplanes with open cockpits. We were able to avoid all strenuous and truly unpleasant training or duties that we really should have done but didn't do. Now, not one of the 12 of us signed up after our conscript training ended, and Colonel Coetzee was forced into retirement when his program didn't work. I think if he'd got 1 or 2 to sign up, it would have been okay, but yeah, we weren't going to do that. But anyway, I was then transferred to the Transvaal Horse Artillery, which had a history dating back centuries, to serve the remaining 5 years of compulsory service, which consisted really of monthly parades or bi-monthly parades on weekends, and then annual 3-week maneuver exercises. The regiment, the Transvaal Horse Artillery Regiment, regimental commanding officer was a World War II veteran, Colonel Bill Fiddler. These were kind of reservists. They weren't permanent force. And he was a golf fanatic. Every year, the regiment competed in a military golf tournament, which Fiddler was dying to win so that he could place the impressive trophy in the regimental mess shelves on which the regiment's battle honours were kept. And there were tons of, they've been in lots of battles in World War I, World War II. When he found out that I was a low handicap golfer, Colonel Fiddler invited me to play around with him at the Johannesburg Country Club, which interestingly enough did not have any Jewish members. Jews were not allowed to be members, but he was a member and he took me on to play. And I played so well that he desperately wanted me on the team. He was confident that I would be able to lead the regiment to victory. And it was only a 4-member team, and one guy could really make a huge difference. The problem that Fiddler had was that the tournament was for commissioned officers only. Now, Fiddler's solution was very simple. Commission me as a second lieutenant, directly from the rank of private, or in the artillery, the Transvaal Horse Artillery, you were called a gunner. So I was going to go from gunner to second lieutenant. Well, he did it. And clearly, I was the least qualified officer in the South African Army. And believe me, the South African Army had lots and lots and lots of incompetent officers, but I was by far the worst. Well, the day of the big, it was a 36-hole tournament arrived, and I was paired with 2 colonels and a major general. We get out on the course in the morning round, and I played very, very well. In fact, I shot 2 under par 70 when almost all scores were well into the 80s. Colonel Fiddler was beaming. He was confident we would win. We had a big lead, and he was absolutely convinced we were going to win. Now, over lunch, my partners, these senior officers, urged me to have a drink. Have a drink, Ivan, have a drink. And at first I resisted the temptation, but eventually agreed to have just one. They were really pushing me. I guess 4 or 5 drinks later, it was time to tee off for the final 18 holes. And I walked out of the air-conditioned restaurant pub into the blazing sun. It was a very hot day, well into the 90s. And the dramatic change of temperature from cold air conditioning into plus 95 degrees sunshine hit me, and I became shaky and disoriented, and I stumbled onto the tee. Quite a few people, having heard of the score I'd put up in the morning, heard of this, my great morning round, were standing around to watch and wanted to see, wanted to watch me play. Somehow I managed to get the ball onto the tee, and after trying to steady myself, eventually took a swing and missed the ball completely, a complete fresh air. Very embarrassing, and but I was really, the change of temperature and all the drinking hit me. Now, I managed to get around the course, but shot a disastrous 88, and we lost the tournament. Colonel Fiddler was justifiably furious, but having promoted me, there was no way he could demote me without cause, or without having to explain why he'd promoted me in the first place. So I kept my commission. Lieutenant Socher, the youngest Jewish officer ever in the South African military. In 1960, a riot in Sharpeville set off disturbances and rioting throughout the country. There was panic. All the reserve forces were mobilized to put down the insurrection. And the military decided that soldiers would not serve in areas near their homes. What they were really frightened of is if you were near your home, you desert. So what they did was they switched troops from Cape Town to Johannesburg and Durban, and they flew our regiment from Johannesburg to Cape Town. In the middle of the night, we were parachuted into Langa location, which was an area set aside for black living, with orders to conduct house-to-house arms searches. The army was frightened of the uprising and wanted to get rid of the arms. And platoons, which comprised of an officer and 7 men, were assigned streets to sweep up and down, going into each and every house. Well, I led my platoon of 7 conscripts, and I decided it would be a much better idea if we were to hide in the bushes rather than search hundreds of houses in which we would be exposed to people who were angry and who would really like to kill the hated white military or police. Now, the idea was to wait until we heard the other platoons get back from searching, from their searches, then join up as if we'd been up and down the streets doing the searches that we'd been ordered to do. And I put this plan forward to the soldiers in my platoon, and really my logic was very simple. I'm an officer, and I'd been told that the first duty of any officer is to take care of the safety and welfare of his men, and I felt that we might be in danger if we searched houses. Surprisingly, my men all agreed that this was a very good decision and demonstrated excellent leadership. So that really, we hid in the bushes and dirtied ourselves up a little bit while the other units all went through searching. And when they got back, we all came out and we did not search, didn't find anything. Nobody spilled the beans, as it really was the way to handle things. In 1976, the year after we emigrated, the Soweto uprising took place, and once again, all reserves were mobilized. I was still in the reserves. Now, I didn't go back to South Africa. In fact, when my accountant called me, he said, "I'm mobilized," I said, "Tell them to start without me, and if they check, they'll find that I was the worst soldier that South Africa had, or certainly said the worst officer." And I didn't go back to South Africa then, and actually it then meant I was placed on a list of deserters, which meant I really couldn't go back to South Africa until the apartheid regime fell. And when Mandela came out, it did fall, but I've never been back to South Africa. So that was my very distinguished military. My business career. My business career was marked by several amazingly lucky breaks. Actually, the story of my life has been luck. After being fired from my first job, which was with the accounting firm of Pete Morrick and Mitchell, I worked for a while in Myra's mom and dad's clothing factory. However, one of the big lessons that I did learn from that was that I have absolutely no dress sense or fashion sense or taste. So any career in the garment, or as it was known as the schmutter business, was absolutely limited. If you didn't have taste or dress sense, what were you doing in the clothing business? Now, looking around what I should do, I consulted with a university professor who suggested that I take a look at the computer business. I had never heard of computers and had no idea at all what they were, what they did, or what you did with them. He did mention the name of a company called IBM. Once again, I'd never heard of them, but I went walking into their offices and then had a very, very tough time persuading IBM to hire me to sell their, at that time, punch card systems. Well, I managed to make the sale and they hired me as a salesman. Then, really after only about a year, I learned that IBM and I weren't really compatible, and they're a wonderful company because I really did resent the total family involvement and commitment that IBM promoted and actually demanded of its employees. The wives had to go to regular luncheons with other wives. Kids got the most amazing gifts at Christmas and other holidays. So IBM influenced every aspect of its employees' life. And the reason they did it was very simple. you had to work very, very hard, and IBM recognized the value of having family support for those efforts. Well, IBM had amazing market intelligence on its competitors, and it was this market intelligence which led me to starting my own company. I quit IBM and traveled to the US, visiting many companies that IBM's marketing intelligence had identified as being viable, and not only being viable, IBM considered them as competitive threats. So I knew that they had to be good because IBM said they were good. And my pitch to those companies was pretty simple. It'll be years and years and years before you get around to selling to South Africa. You first got to penetrate the European markets, and South Africa's down in the middle of nowhere. You've got nothing to lose by giving me South African marketing rights. Any sales that I make will be sales you never expected to get. I will pay for any orders I place with letters of credit, so that'll take away any credit risk. So Computer Advances, the name of the company I started, was able to secure South African marketing rights. These companies really didn't look into our background because they really felt they had nothing to lose, and otherwise they wouldn't have given me the marketing rights. And after a pretty slow start, Computer Advances took off, did extremely well, and actually made quite a bit of money. But it certainly was IBM the later. Then, with Myra really pushing me into honouring the promise we'd made to my father to leave South Africa, I had to come up with something different, a way of doing that. And the problem that I faced was that South Africa had very, very strict currency restrictions. If you were caught taking money out of the country, you went to jail for 20, 30 years. And South African jails were no joke. So while we had money in South Africa, our family could only take, at that time, it was a grand total of $30,000 per family, scarcely enough to keep you going. Anyway, what I did was figure out a way to use money that we had in South Africa to finance a business that would be overseas. What I did was, well, the initial plan was to develop a computer system using R&D money that I had with money I had in South Africa, and then actually to move to Switzerland, focus our sales efforts on the European market. I really was scared of the American market because I thought the people there would be much too tough competitively. Now, the company I set up for this purpose was called Socher. That's SYFA, which stood for System for Access. Later on, when we came to America, a lot of people kidded it as actually System from Africa. And the Socher team I put together designed and developed a specialized computer system that was aimed at an emerging market for many computers specializing in data communications. At this time, I really must pay tribute to Zach Kong, who I had hired at Computer Advances and who was the technical brains behind everything I ever did in the computer and communications field. A little bit about Zach. Zach was born in South Africa to Chinese parents whose family had come to South Africa as indentured labor. They had been brought as laborers. The white apartheid regime treated the Chinese as non-whites and applied all the apartheid restrictions to Chinese. The same restrictions that were applied to millions of blacks were applied to Chinese, which meant Chinese could only live in non-white areas. Chinese had to carry passes in order to travel around the country. Chinese could not eat in whites-only restaurants, could not go into whites-only restrooms. Now, when I hired Zach, we were defying South African law. But South Africa at that time was doing a lot of business with Japan. For example, Japanese were taking away iron ore, like from Tapasimbi, but Japanese were treated as honorary whites, so they had they could live like whites. And I think that many Afrikaners, and we did deal with the government, actually thought that Zach must be Japanese. They couldn't imagine us defying the law. Zach still had to live in a non-white area, which was little more than a nasty slum. Anyway, Zach was the guy who had and has a deep understanding of technology, and he steered me in all my businesses. Zach could explain the most complex technology terms in simple language that I could understand. So, that translation capability was amazing. When the Socher team and staff complained about having to move to Switzerland, where a new language would have to be learned, I managed to persuade an American company called Computer Automation to merge with Socher, and we moved to Irvine, California. At Computer Automation, we did well, and the Socher team managed to win some big contracts, beating out IBM and other major established computer companies. We were upstarts who managed to break through in a fairly big way. And I made a fair amount of money selling Computer Automation stock on the NASDAQ exchange. Unfortunately, we grew much faster than our limited management capabilities. We weren't sophisticated managers. In the space of a year and a half, we opened factories in Ireland, in India, in Dallas, and we opened operations and sales offices in Germany, France, and Italy. And we just weren't capable of managing it. So poor management and many more bad decisions really saw the company implode in a bad way. Thankfully, I managed to cash out before Computer Automation collapsed completely. Then, in partnership with the venture capital firm, I became the president and CEO of a struggling technology company called Amdax, which designed and manufactured satellite modems. The founder and owner of the company had died, and the company was in deep trouble, but some of its satellite technology was quite interesting, and Zach saw ways of adapting it. So at Amdax in 1983, a team led by Zach and others, mostly people I brought over from Socher and Computer Automation, invented the first cable modems, about 15 years ahead of the internet. So the timing was a little off. Anyway, we caught a Wall Street fad. Wall Street suddenly became fascinated with local area networks and put together a merger of Amdax with another land company, and we went public at an absolutely ridiculous valuation. I cashed out because I knew we couldn't live up to their valuation. Actually, a week after the IPO, the company was worth more than General Motors. Typical Wall Street lunacy. Having cashed out, I was now trying to figure out what to do next when I was having a discussion with Ryan. I was giving him, after preaching to him about how important it was to work hard, to focus and dedicate. He looked pretty bored, but then he looked at me straight in the eyes and he said to me, Dad, yeah, I hear what you're saying. However, work just isn't fun. That's a very simple statement, but it really got me thinking. I thought about this simple statement a lot, so much that it provided an epiphany. I looked back on my business career and I actually discovered I really hadn't had much fun. It had been very painful, traveling and meetings, and it really wasn't fun. And at that stage, I said to myself, the only reason for me to continue working would be to make more money. And given the way we lived, we really didn't need to make any more money. So in 1948, at least 1984, at the age of 43, I decided to retire. We built a home on Hilton Head Island, and I retired to play golf. Now, everybody who knew me, predictions were that this retirement wouldn't last more than a few months. In fact, I opened a book as to how long it would take for me to unretire. And actually, I proved them wrong. I stayed retired for 3 years. And the reason I unretired was to start a new business in Washington, D.C., in partnership with Zach Kong, who'd been the brains behind any venture I've been involved in. After Amdex had gone public, Zach had set up his own company called Network Software Associates, NSA. And NSA developed communication software. And the partnership, my partnership with Zach, involved me setting up a Washington organization to sell NSA products to the federal government. Ron and Larry joined this business, much to my joy, and they can tell you all about the business. I'm sure they have many stories. It really should be noted that over the years I also started quite a few other businesses which did not make it. In fact, I think the number is 17. So I didn't have many successes and lots of failures. However, thankfully, being a bean counter, I always managed to objectively evaluate progress, or the lack thereof, and had the self-discipline to pull the plug before too much money was lost in any one of these ventures. While on the subject of business, I want to point out that when I started my first company, Computer Advances, I had one goal, simple goal: make enough money to secure my family's financial future. Being an accountant by training, I carefully calculated how much money this would take to provide the kind of financial security that my family needed. And after some tough struggles getting off the ground, Computer Advances took off, and it wasn't long before my goal of financial security was reached. And in fact, it was exceeded by quite a bit. I went roaring past the number. Bucked by this, I set a new goal. I wanted to be publicly recognized for my business success. My ego needed some stroking. So I had my sales marketing department start generating press coverage, which actually culminated in a cover page story in South Africa's equivalent of Business Week. It was computers were all new, and it was wunderkind of the computer business. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before I was very well known around Johannesburg, and particularly where we lived. And I found that when I walked into a restaurant or into other public places, I could see people turning around and whispering asides, pointing at me, and then we say, "Oh, there's the guy." And so neighborhood families started talking about the new rich guy, the tycoon, and it wasn't long before the loss of anonymity and privacy started to get me down. I learned how valuable personal privacy is, and I think that it really bothered me when kids at school would say things to Ral and Larry about their big shot tycoon dad. So it just fame and recognition just didn't do it for me. In fact, it had a negative effect. Well, the next thing I decided would be great would be to be in a position to exercise control over people and their lives, to have this power. And computer advances had grown very rapidly, and it wasn't too long before we were employing hundreds of people. And I kind of bossed in this. I had the ability to control these people, influence their lives, and this was great. Until the day came when we missed our goals, we didn't meet our growth plans, and we always had to hire in advance of plans, and I was actually forced to lay off people. I found this to be heartbreaking, soul-destroying, and I vowed to do whatever I could to avoid having to lay off people again. In fact, I missed a lot of business opportunities because I wouldn't take a chance of having to face that. The lesson I learned was clear, that with that kind of responsibility, the responsibility of controlling people wasn't worth the pain of layoffs. It wasn't worth it to me. Thereafter, I didn't set any clear goals, and certainly one of my goals was to avoid having to suffer that kind of pain. Myra, a little bit about her background. Myra was admitted into medical school at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is where we met and started dating. It was tough to get into medical school, and only the smartest people were accepted into medical school. Now, partying with me, we did a lot of partying, took its toll. So Myra dropped out of medical school, and she then enrolled at the University of Natal to study commerce, and she completed 90% of the requirements before we moved from Durban to Johannesburg when I joined IBM, and the University of Natal was in Durban, so that took care. She didn't get a degree there. When we emigrated to the States, Myra became a full-time stay-at-home mom, taking care of a home which she'd never done in her life, but she learned quickly and did a fantastic job. And after Ron and Larry had left for Dartmouth, I retired and we moved to Hilton Head Island. Myra wasn't an enthusiastic golfer, and she decided to get back into the medical field. So she began studying and working as a lowly emergency medical technician and EMT, and she started at the very bottom. Now, when we moved to Washington in 1988, Myra enrolled at George Washington University's School of Health Sciences, and 2 or 3 years later graduated summa cum laude with a BS degree in emergency management. The next thing she did was she worked for a while in George Washington's emergency department, and working there, Myra then founded TriMed, a company she called TriMed, which to 9/11 became a very, very successful consulting operation business. TriMed was in business for 20 years, and Myra became a leading figure in the emergency preparedness field, traveling all around the world to represent and support the US government and US operations. Several generals and an admiral whom Myra had worked with while they were still in the military served on TriMed's board of advisors. She was held in that high esteem. And for many years, Myra held assistant professorships at George Washington University and at Vanderbilt University. So she did an amazing job, and she certainly is one of the smartest people that I know. Built a company, came in to get herself educated late in life. I need to talk about somebody who played a huge role in my family's life, Mary Palmer. Maiden name was Radeba. Mary, a Zulu, came to Johannesburg from Escort, a small town in Natal. Mary was a young Zulu woman looking for work. Dad and Mom hired her as a live-in servant to cook and help around the house. Mary quickly became an integral part of the Socher family. Shortly after Jenny, my older sister, was born, my mother fractured her skull in a motor accident. Mary took over the household, took care of Jenny, took care of my mother over months of rehabilitation. When Mom came home from the hospital, Mary nursed her back to health. After Jenny died, neither my father nor my mother could bring themselves to break the news to me. I'd been brought home and I still didn't know that Jenny had died a few weeks earlier. So it was left to Mary to tell me that my beloved sister had died. Mary was a great comfort. She played a huge role in raising me and my sister Charlene. She played a similar role when Raoul and Larry were born before we left South Africa. While Mary was very loving, she was also very, very strict. She was a disciplinarian and demanding of the Socher children. Late in his life, when Dad was suffering from dementia, Mary was one of the few people who could get through to him and who could communicate effectively with him. She cared for him with great tenderness. Mary, one determination in life was to learn. She had bought into the idea that education was the only way upwards. So on her day off, and there was one day a week, she attended school, and after 15 years of dedicated study, proudly matriculated. That's the equivalent of high school graduation. So she graduated with a high school diploma. In the apartheid society, this was an amazing achievement. I think less than 2 or 3% of the black population achieved matriculation. After we left South Africa, Mary worked for a few years for family friends before retiring to her hometown of Escort, where she built a comfortable home. She had been a diligent saver, and we paid her a pension for 25 years so that she could live well, fairly well. Mary had an absolutely wonderful time whenever she came to the United States to visit us. First time she came was to attend Larry's bar mitzvah. She came to Round and Larry's weddings, and she was able to see her first, as she put it, great-grandchild, Benjamin. And Mary, strangely enough, fiercely opposed Mandela simply because her Zulu tribe did not trust members of the Xhosa tribe, which is Nelson Mandela's tribe. What I can say about Mary was I loved Mary as a mother, and there's no doubt that she truly loved me as a son. And Mary, coming from patriarchal tribal system, the Zulus, believed in the total supremacy of men. So what Dad and I said counted much more than anything my mother or Myra or Charlene thought or said. Then, when Mary died, we learned another horrible secret, that as a teenager, she had given birth to twin daughters. One died very young. The other daughter grew up in their home village, with Mary sending money to support her. In retirement, Mary continued to support her daughter and grandchildren, and certainly encouraged them to study. Mary kept the existence of her family secret from the Socher family, and it was only when she died. She actually, I think the reason was she feared she'd lose her job if we learned that she had children or had been dishonest. She was also pretty ashamed that she was an unmarried mother. Several years after Mary died, I was approached to help financially to pay for the university education of one of her granddaughters. We happily paid for 4 years of study at the University of Natal, and Mary's granddaughter graduated with a degree in chemical engineering. Mary would have been so proud. The notion of one of her descendants having a university degree would have been the happiest moment of her life. I truly loved her, as did Myra, Raoul, Larry, and every member of the Socher family. After I retired for the second time, I started volunteering for the Montgomery County Humane Society, which operated the county's animal shelter. I enjoyed walking shelter dogs. Every day I'd go and walk shelter dogs, give them some exercise. However, it wasn't long before I saw just how badly the Humane Society was being run, and I offered to help bring about some improvements, to improve operations by introducing some computer technology. They didn't use any. While trying to implement a key system to track animals, I uncovered shocking, appalling management. And there was corruption, secret payoffs, and other scandals. This all in a non-profit. And the bottom line is this incompetence and dishonesty was resulting in the unnecessary euthanasia of many animals that could have been saved. I was so upset that I vowed I was going to do everything I could to bring about major changes for the animals. I wasn't going to allow this to go on. However, I certainly didn't appreciate what it would take to unseat the Humane Society's management and change the way the county cared for unwanted animals. Really underestimated. My efforts to bring about the changes included mounting a campaign to have this Humane Society board of directors voted out of office so that a new board could be installed, which I handpicked, and the new board would install new management. When the Humane Society refused to provide a list of members so that I could canvass them on behalf of the new board, I filed a lawsuit to hand over the list. And they fought this tooth and nail, though they never had a leg to stand on. And Maya and I spent around $180,000 on legal fees, and the Humane Society wasted more than $250,000 of donated funds to its legal fees, and it was a lost cause, their case. When we won the lawsuit, and they were ordered to hand over the membership lists, the Humane Society wasted even more money appealing to the Maryland Supreme Court, which threw out their case after a 10-minute hearing. Anyway, we won that battle. The Humane Society management was changed, which led to improvements. But more importantly, before I did it, I had set out to learn about animal welfare problems. And I traveled around the country visiting shelters, both good and bad, and meeting animal welfare experts. This knowledge gave me a really good understanding of what a shelter should look like and how a good shelter was managed. So then I started lobbying county officials and supporting the election of people in the county who could be relied upon to support animal welfare causes. And some of the problems had been neglect on the part of Doug Duncan. Doug Duncan didn't give a damn about animals. These efforts have paid off, and I'm so happy. The proof is there for all to see. Based on my recommendations, the county has built a new shelter. They did need to build one anyway and had plans to do so. However, this one that I got them to build was modeled on the Washington Animal Rescue League's renovated shelter, which incorporates many forward-looking ideas for the care of sheltered animals. The Montgomery County shelter is now one of the very best, I suspect, in the world. It is amazing the job they've done doing that. Most importantly, the county also accepted and acted on a report which included recommendations that the county should take over the operation of the shelter from the Humane Society, should not contract it out. The shelter is now managed and staffed by the police department, which has hired highly competent, well qualified, and suitable professionals, and is paying them as such. I'm very proud of this work, and it's paid off so well. The other little legacy is that the thrift shop that Life Animals was the non-profit organization I set up to tackle the Humane Society. Well, Life Animals Thrift Shop is doing very, very well and has consistently given more than $100,000 a year, and each year to animal welfare causes. The $90,000 that Myra and I spent in setting up the thrift shop is certainly paying dividends for the animals of Montgomery County. So I don't have many legacies in life, but one of the quiet legacies I have is the new county shelter and the way it's being run, and a thrift shop that gives a lot of money for animals. And as Myra and I dearly love animals, these legacies have meaning in our lives.